Hey everyone, it's Jess. I hope everyone is doing well. Today's video is courtesy of one of you guys actually, so thank you Philodendron. I'm sorry that I pronounced your tag and name incorrectly, but thank you for leaving a suggestion on one of my last videos about doing a video around caring for rarer type of philodendrons. I thought that was a great video to do, so I hope you will find some of these tips helpful in this video. So how I thought I'd do this video is I will do a section, quite a brief section at the beginning about how to care for philodendrons more generally, just because I think it's useful to sort of set the scene for caring for philodendrons more generally before we dive into more specific care tips for the more uncommon or rarer types of philodendrons. And then the second part of the video, I thought I'd use the philodendrons I have to showcase some of the examples of care tips for the more uncommon types of philodendrons. If I sound like I'm out of breath, I think I'm coming down with a cold, so apologies for that in advance. Now I'm going to start off and say my collection of philodendrons is probably not as rare as some of the rarer types of philodendrons out there, such as the Philodendron billeti or the Philodendron Isomanii. Kaylee Ellen on YouTube actually has done a great video on rare philodendrons. She calls them the rare plant index, and they go through the different types of philodendrons out there. So in those videos she covers some philodendrons which are actually quite rare, but the philodendrons I have, I would consider them still quite uncommon. They're definitely not the ones that you see in some of the nurseries or big buy plant stores, but then again they're also not as rare as some of the really collectible items. What I did do is I thought I'd bring in some of the philodendrons I have that are a little bit more uncommon and just do a care video. Right here I have with me is I have one of my Philodendron silver clouds, which is a beautiful specimen. A beautiful leaf. I've got my Philodendron gloriosum, so I've got her here. I've got one of my Philodendron painted ladies. Now this one doesn't have as much yellow variegation as the one I have outside, but I'm going to insert a but you'll see that one later on in the video. I've got my Philodendron Atabapoense. I've got my Philodendron Atabapoense, and I'm really excited for this one. And then I've got my Philodendron Black Knight. So these are some of the, I guess, rarer philodendrons that I own. I didn't bring my Philodendron Pink Princess in at the moment. I know that it's quite a highly sought after philodendron in the US, but in Sydney it's actually become quite common, and I've also got a whole care video on the Pink Princess which I'll link below. But what I'll do is I'll go through some of the care tips for these more uncommon types of philodendrons using these philodendrons I have here as example. One thing to keep in mind with this video, even though it's about rarer types of philodendrons, what is rare will depend on things like their availability in your country, and also of course your personal preference. So I thought I'd start off this video by talking through some of the more common tips associated with caring for your philodendrons. So philodendrons is a member of the aroid family. It's one of the biggest members of the aroid family. I think with philodendrons there's about 480 species of philodendrons, which is crazy. Philodendrons are normally quite hardy houseplants, so in terms of care, the natural habitat for philodendrons is the central to subtropic areas of the world. So these are areas around the equator. I thought another interesting fact about a philodendron is that the word philodendron is derived from the Greek word philo, which means love, and dendron, which means plant or tree. So its translation is love tree, which is, I think, such a sweet name for this plant because I feel like a lot of people do really love this plant. We know that these guys exist in rainforest areas. What that typically means from a lighting perspective is that they like to have quite indirect light, often in shadier areas, and they don't like bright direct light. They like to be kept moist but not too wet. You might have heard the expression no soggy feet, which means that these plants don't like to get their roots too damp. You want to make sure that the medium that they're potted in is quite aerated so that it does allow the water to dry out between waterings. And you can understand this being epiphilic plants. They're sort of attached up in the trees, and so when they get their water, when water comes down, it normally would run off the side of the tree. So their roots are not always going to be subterranean, which means under the ground. So being up in the air, it gives them a lot of opportunity for their roots to be aerated, which also reduces mold or root rot. In terms of watering for philodendrons, typically you can be quite generous in watering, but again, being mindful of how much you water and when you water, because you don't want to overwater your plant, or at least you don't want to make the medium that they're sitting in to be too wet. Depending on where you keep them, how warm the area is. Philodendrons as houseplants, I think normally the rule of thumb is you water them every once or twice a week, depending on if the top of the soil is dry or not. In terms of temperatures for these plants, given that these plants are native to those tropical areas of the world, they live near the equator, an ideal temperature for them is probably between 18 to 25 to 26 degrees Celsius, which is, I think, 65 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So these plants don't like to be too cold. So for those who may live in areas where it snows during the winter or that you get frost, you want to make sure that you are prepared. Living here in Sydney, obviously it's quite warm throughout the year, so I find that these guys tend to do quite well seem to do okay over winter. Now, in terms of pests for philodendrons in general, they're normally quite hardy plants, so they're not going to experience too many troubles or issues with pests. However, I think the biggest pest or concern that you just have to be aware of is root rot. And the reason for that is because as houseplants, there might be a tendency for them to be overwatered. Given that they're normally sitting in pots of soil, you just want to be careful that either the medium that you're the medium that you're potting your philodendron in is quite aerated. It gives it a lot of opportunity for the water to be evaporated. But the first care tip I have for the more rare or uncommon type of philodendrons is what is known as some of these velvet philodendrons. So the velvety types of philodendrons that I have is the Philodendron silver cloud and the Philodendron gloriosum. Now, I think what constitutes it being known as a velvet philodendron, at least the gloriosum is a better example, is their leaves have this really soft texture. It's very, very soft to touch, and sometimes when the light hits it just right, there is a bit of sparkle in these leaves. So I think the Philodendron gloriosum is a beautiful example of a velvety type of philodendron. Now, there's other philodendrons out there that are quite velvety, such as the Philodendron glorious, the Philodendron gigas, and Philodendron micans. So with velvety philodendrons, I was doing a little bit of research on what gave the leaf its texture, and what I found was velvet plants have teeny little hairs on their leaves, which gives it that really soft to touch texture. Now, the camera won't be able to pick it up, but on these leaves, at least on a microscopic level, there's these tiny hairs which stick up on the epidermis, on the what is known as the cuticle level of the plant. So that is the outermost level of the plant leaf before the epidermis level of the leaf. Now, Based on my research, the reason why we have velvet leaves is it's a way for the plant to protect itself either against insects from being munched on, because hair makes it a little bit more difficult for insects to munch on. Now if we contrast it to other philodendrons with a more waxy leaf like this on the painted lady, one of the tips for the velvet philodendrons is just to be aware that their leaves are a little bit more delicate than compared to the philodendrons with the waxier leaf. Make sure you keep them away from direct bright sunlight to burn a little bit easier, given that they're quite delicate and they're quite soft to touch. The other tip is, of course, don't do what I just did just then, which was touching your leaf too much, because there's some oils you have on your hand which when you rub on a leaf you can leave some of your natural oils on the leaf, which might impact the leaf's ability to fend off against pests or protect that epidermis layer in the leaf. But sometimes you just can't resist because they're so soft, but you don't want to touch them too much, particularly because we know that they have teeny little hairs on their leaves, and so by touching it you're damaging that hair. Another tip for the philodendron velvets, from my experience, they tend to be a little bit more sensitive to watering, so you want to make sure that they get enough water but not too much water. Having said that, I did recently experience some bad plant parenting with my philodendron silver cloud, so I didn't water it for about a week or so when I went on holiday, and when I got back I found that the leaves were paper thinned. All its stems were, it was incredibly mushy and it was sort of collapsed over itself. It's been a couple of days, I'd say 4 days since I water it. It's really perked back up. What I take away from that is, yes, you've got to be careful and keep an eye out on the watering for this plant, but it is quite hardy. Another thing to note is these plants keep water in their stems. A good way to check for when you need to water it is if you find that your stem gets a little bit mushy, given that it is a delicate plant, it might be time for you to water this. Another thing for velvets is I find that they can be a little bit more susceptible to spider mites, is because these guys prefer a more humid environment compared to its other philodendron cousins. It is another great place for spider mites because they do love that warmth and moisture. Those are some of the care tips I have for the more velvet type of philodendrons. If you do like or want a video on velvet philodendrons specifically, let me know and I'll be sure to do a more in-depth research and video covering them. But these are the first rarer types of philodendrons I thought I'd cover. The next type of philodendron I thought I'd cover would be the variegated type of philodendron. Now, the only variegated philodendron I have at the moment is my philodendron painted lady. I did recently just get an autumn queen, but it's coming in the mail, so when that comes I'll show you guys. Now, what I have is I've got my philodendron painted lady here. I've got one of them, and this one doesn't have as much yellow variegation as the one outside, which I'll insert a clip right now which shows that philodendron. But philodendrons can be rare because of their variegation. As we know with any variegated plants, the fact that it has variegation makes them a little bit more rare or difficult to come by. Now with variegation, we know that it's created by a virus in the plant which eats at or limits the ability for the plant to create more chlorophyll. And we know that chlorophyll is that molecule in a plant which helps it translate sunlight into food. So with any variegated plants, your plant will have a tendency to want to get rid of the virus, of course, and so what you want to make sure is the environment just right for it so that it doesn't feel the need to get rid of that virus too quickly and in a sense lose that variegation. The tip I have for maintaining variegation is to give your plant enough light so that it doesn't feel the need to produce more chlorophyll. I guess a good reason why I'm showing this painted lady and the painted lady outside is because the one I have outside does get a lot more light than this one, and you can tell that the difference between these two plants is the one that I have indoors is a lot more green than the one I have outdoors, and the reason for that is probably because this one is not getting as much light as it needs, whereas the one that I have outdoors, it's sitting in a much more sunnier sunnier location, and therefore it maintains its variegation, its yellow variegation, quite well. So a big tip for caring for variegated philodendrons is to make sure that they get enough light so that the plant doesn't feel the need to produce more chlorophyll in order to sustain itself, and therefore it would have more, it's more inclined to be able to maintain the virus that's creating the variegation. I did a whole video on maintaining the variegation in your pink princess, so I might link that here as well, because it does go in depth into what variegation is, how does the virus cause it, and it does have a lot more tips in terms of how to maintain the variegation on your plants. Some of the more uncommon types of philodendrons you might come across is darker philodendrons, such as this black knight. The appeal for these darker philodendrons is of course how dark they can get, and I was doing a little bit of research on dark plants in general, and I think it's equally applicable to philodendrons. The reason why plants can be darker or appear black is because of the presence of a molecule known as anthocyanin, which is an antioxidant for plants. Now, with most of the plants that we see, we know that plants are generally green in color, and the reason for that is because chlorophyll, which is a predominant molecule within plants to help plants photosynthesize, attracts red and blue light, and so that means the remaining green light bounces off the molecule, which makes us see green. Now, with anthocyanin, which is prevalent in darker plants or black plants, it absorbs the green color, which means that our eyes see more of a red and blue, so a dark purpley color, which I thought was quite interesting. So normally plants with a higher concentration of anthocyanin give off a darker foliage. Sometimes it can look quite black. Another interesting factor then is that darker plants are not really naturally occurring, but the result of cultivars. So that means that people have gone and created new plants or hybrids. Now, with these plants, particularly with darker philodendrons, I actually found it was quite hard to find a lot of information out there around care tips for darker philodendrons. But one thing I did notice based on caring for my black knight is a number of things. The first one being heat. I find that my black knight and my royal queen, which is also another dark philodendron, tend to respond quite well to warmer environments. So I have these guys sitting on a heat pad, which is a heat pad for reptiles, but I've noticed that once I started putting him on a heat pad, a lot of aerial roots started coming out, which suggests to me that this guy enjoy more warmer environments compared to his other velvety cousins, or even the painted lady. The thing I notice is that with the waxier varieties of philodendrons is the wax on the plant leaf is an indication of how well it can retain moisture. What this means for me is that this is a plant that retains moisture a little bit better than its velvety cousins, because the wax makes evaporation from the leaves a little bit more difficult, because there's a barrier that makes it more challenging for the water to evaporate. Now, what that means to me is I've just got to be careful when watering these philodendrons, and that's actually true with this one, because my black knight, I had potted him up initially in some soil and I was watering him about once a week, but one day I found that his roots, decided to check on his roots, and his roots were actually starting to rot, and that was a sign to me that even watering once a week was too much for this philodendron. And so now I've got him potted up in some, well, not potted up, I've got him sitting in some perlite, because I want to help his roots recover. And so perlite is an excellent medium for being incredibly light and aerated, so I've got him sitting in there. I guess an overall tip with looking after rarer or more uncommon type of philodendrons is to just pay a little bit more attention to your plant. So you might want to experiment a little bit around lighting, humidity and heat, and see how your plant reacts to each of those factors, because care on the internet might not be as readily available compared to the more common philodendrons. I have my black knight and my royal queen sitting with me they live in my bedroom, and so what that means is every day I I'm able to see how they're going and make sure I adjust their climate accordingly depending on how they're reacting to a change in their environment. So one thing I noticed was when I put him on the heat mat, he definitely started sprouting out these aerial roots, which to me suggests that he likes heat. Another tip that I have, which is not only applicable to rare philodendrons or philodendrons but most plants in general, is looking at how big their new leaves are for the plant. As a general rule of thumb, the bigger the new leaf you see, the happier your plant is. Now one thing I did notice is this is the newest leaf on my Black Knight. This is an older leaf. Now that suggests to me that this plant is not as happy as it could be. Now whilst I've got it still sitting in a heat mat, I can see that its aerial roots are sort of reaching out for something to hold on. So if I create a moss pole or something for it to climb up on, this will make the plant happier. The other rarer type of philodendron I wanted to show everyone is my new Philodendron atabapoense, and boy am I so happy to be able to have this plant. He's got these gorgeous, look at the back of his leaf, beautiful aubergine color, and then this is the front of his leaf. I love the contrast when you flip this leaf, and I love the shape of the leaf. I'm really attracted to plants with weird shaped leaves. I think they're so strange. But this is one of my prized philodendrons. I personally think that this philodendron is quite difficult to come by, and I was definitely stoked when I was able to get a cutting of him. I have been able to find some research for this philodendron. I find that he's quite a hardy plant, and a lot of the care tips I see online are no different than the typical philodendron care tips you find. So that is making sure you keep him in indirect light, you're making sure that you water him not too much. You don't want wet feet. Because this one's a cutting, I've got mine sitting in water at the moment, so I don't really water him. One thing I might share with everyone is, given that he is a cutting and he actually is generating some new roots, I'm pretty excited about that. I might just share with everyone something that you might do with not only your rarer philodendron cuttings but just your plant cuttings in general, is when you get them in the mail, or depending wherever you get them, I like to put them in water with a small concentration of sea salt. Now sea salt is not a fertilizer for plants per se, but what it does is that it actually stimulates root growth, and so I've got him sitting in this water with a couple of drops of sea salt. A rule of thumb is being diluted is better than being concentrated. I've done that so that it can just encourage his roots to form a lot more, and I find by doing that with all of my cuttings, it actually has helped in encouraging greater root growth in some of these plants. So that's a tip I would leave with everyone, particularly if you're getting a cutting of a rarer plant. You want to make sure it survives because it's a special plant. He's also getting new growth, a new leaf, which is super exciting. Guys, I hope you found some of these tips quite helpful in caring for more uncommon or rarer types of philodendrons. I'm really hesitant to use the word rare philodendrons in this video because I'm just conscious that the philodendrons I have at the moment aren't exactly rare, because as we all know there's some incredibly rare ones out there that are very expensive. But I hope I've shared with you some tips that you might find helpful in caring for some of the more uncommon philodendrons. If there is a particular philodendron, whether it be a velvety philodendron, darker philodendrons, or maybe variegated philodendrons that you want me to do a little bit more research on and share some more tips on that specific variety of philodendrons, I'm more than happy to. But I hope you found this video helpful. Priscilla, Dine, I hope you enjoyed this video. Definitely let me know if there's any questions, guys, but I'll see you in my next video. Bye!